Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Aubrey's Strawberry Time. Good, we'll call it Strawberry Time, why not? Welcome to Aubrey's Story Time. Now, this is a monthly little edition of my stream, podcast, whatever this is, where I tell you some of the stories I've discovered along my travels whilst playing and touring, and also through my life over the years. Some of them I've been collecting for a long time, some of them are new, some of them have been made up, because that's part of the game we're going to play. I'm going to tell you a selection of stories. If we've got enough time, I've got 4, but if not, we'll have at least 3. Some of them will be true, some of them will be complete bullshit. And for a bit of fun, because I don't have a budget for prizes, it's up to you guys to guess which one it is, which A, B or C, 1, 2 or 3, which is true, which is bollocks. Feel free to discuss it quite happily in the comments. Now, unlike my other streams, which I will talk about later, I don't really interact with the chat until the stories are told, and then we have the post-stream chat. For those of you who are listening on a podcast, feel free to join me on Twitch on the final Monday of every month for Strawberry Time, where you can join in the chat afterwards, where we go on strange tangents. I answer questions from the chat, and we try and delve a little bit deeper, but I do not give the game away, because the whole point is that I tell you which ones are true and which ones are false next month. So we have something to listen to. So, which brings us on to the first bit. Apologies if this is your first Aubrey story time, because what I'm about to tell you will not make a blind bit of sense, because we started this game last week. If you have got this on the podcast, make sure you listen to episode 3 first, and then hear those stories, and I will, before you come back here, unless you don't give a shite and you're more interested in the stories that are coming in this episode. So, let's start off with what happened last week. So I told several stories based on the life and times of Henry VIII, a person that I discovered that some people have been saying that the English sort of revere Henry VIII as a historical figure. I don't think I've ever met anyone who ever considers Henry VIII a good king or a popular king, or he's just a magnet for interesting stories of his time, and being a debauched bastard, basically. But I've never heard anyone describe him as good. So if you're watching this thinking, oh, this is just more glamorization of Henry VIII, far from it. He's a complete bellend, but he's a fascinating bellend that is a great sort of doorway into the era that he's from, which is why I found so many stories. So there are 3 stories. Forgive me if I don't tell them in the same order they were before. I'll just give a quick recap and then tell you which one's true and which one's false. So there were 3 stories. One about his obsession with Thomas Becket, one about his obsession with being remembered in the afterlife and where he ended up, and the third one was the my brain's just gone dead. The third one, Thomas Becket. What are you talking about? I just looked in the stream. What's going on in my brain? Actually had it written down. Yes, that's it. I got confused. So, statues, Thomas Becket, and where he ended up being stored. So, the quick summary of the 3 stories. The Thomas Becket story is that Henry VIII was obviously famous for pissing off popes, pissing off the clergy, and didn't want anyone to rebel. So one person who was famous for it was at the time St. Thomas, who was one of those people, Thomas Becket, not Thomas A. Becket. That was a typo that got repeated over and over again. That's completely true, by the way. I discovered that from QI when I first heard that, and then I read up on it, and it turns out it's completely true. One manuscript said accidentally put an A after his name, and it was just repeated and repeated and repeated for hundreds of years. He was called Thomas Becket. That was his name, the Archbishop of Canterbury. So Thomas Becket was the Archbishop for a very earlier rendition of Henry, and basically he was the Archbishop that was killed on the orders of the king, saying, "Who will rid me of this troublesome priest?" He was executed by some drunk priests. The king signed some contrition acts, wandered through the streets naked, to apologise for that sort of thing, and so it was canonised as a saint, the idea of being a person that is pious and blah 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 blah. Henry VIII hated the idea of people having a saint that was famous for disagreeing with kings, so decided to have him removed from history in a similar way that he did it to Anne Boleyn, which is why none of us know the name Anne Boleyn. So what he did is he smashed the altar and the shrine to Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral, and then also went around he had his men go around the town destroying any effigy with his name on it, any statues, any pictures, anything with Thomas Becket written on it, removed. But unbeknownst to him, the main thing that they used as a sigil was a chough, or a red-throated chough, which is a bird, a black bird that is all over Canterbury, and the people of Canterbury didn't really particularly give a flying toss about the name being taken away, because as soon as the commissioners left, they A, repainted everything, and B, just laughed because there were birds absolutely everywhere. This is completely true. Henry VIII did try to eradicate the name of Thomas Becket, and spent a lot of time and money on a fruitful act, making him ironically more popular than he was even before he was just a canonised saint for pissing off kings, because now he was a canonised saint that had pissed off 2 kings by just being good at his job. So that's the first story. The second story was that Henry VIII had desires of having a mausoleum for himself to be built after his death, and he wanted this mausoleum to be grander than Westminster Cathedral. And remember, this isn't the Westminster Abbey that is there today, because that was destroyed in a fire years and years and years ago. This is the version before then, which still would have been spectacularly large and would have been the biggest building in the south coast, southern England, for a very, very long time. And basically it was expensive and stupid and really idiotic to build something for one person, so his son Edward decided, no, I'm not building it, and then died. His daughter Mary said, no, you called my mother a whore, and then she died. Then she gave it to Elizabeth I, who said, no, you called my mum a whore, had her executed, and called me a bastard several times, so you can fucking do one. Also, I'm fighting the Spanish, so do piss off. And then she passed it on, and it's been passed on through different generations, and the plans for this mausoleum still exist, and that they were never filled out because no one wanted to spend the money on it, and after a while it became more of a tradition to pass on these plans to the following monarch, and that Henry VIII is still technically in storage in a chapel in the in Windsor Castle. And when the Queen had the last passed away Queen, not Elizabeth I, Elizabeth II, when her family had the smaller, less grand funeral after the grand pageant thing that was on television, they did it in a room where Henry VIII was in a box in the corner. This is also completely true. Henry VIII did want a mausoleum bigger than Westminster Abbey, and he didn't get his way because he was a massive, massive prick. And he is still effectively in storage in the corner of a small chapel in Windsor Castle, and they're showing no signs of moving it because he was a massive dickhead and no one's got any money left. So the third story is slightly connected to that because he was obsessed with the mausoleum. He was obsessed with being immortal, which is why he commissioned loads of paintings, but was very superstitious, as a lot of people were at the time, and a lot of people had been after him and before him. He did not commission any statues of himself while he was alive because he thought that was very, very bad luck. But what he did do is, like I said, have paintings and mausoleums and other such things. But there is one statue of Henry VIII in London, and that is the same amount of statues that Freddie Mercury has in London. One. And that comes from the story, where a hospital in London was due to be closed by Henry VIII's commissioners during the Reformation, and they turned up to basically liquidate all of its funds and shut it down, and when they arrived they realised it was a fucking hospital, and then thought, that's not going to look good. The optics would have been bad, and then his commissioners thought, we're just going to leave it because that's just not right. You guys carry on doing what you're doing because the king really appreciates you and thinks you're great, but please don't tell the king because we'll probably get murdered. And so they decide to say, okay, we won't tell the king and you won't get murdered, we'll just carry on as things are. And so to celebrate this, or to kind of make everyone aware that this was going on, so maybe the king wouldn't come back later and try and nick whatever they had left. I mean, it was a hospital. They're not really famous for being filled with money. They built a small statue of Henry VIII. They put over the door, and it's still there today, because that's also true. He does have only one statue in London, and the same as Freddie Mercury, which is one on top of a hospital front door, commemorating the fact that he didn't shut it down when he was greedily stripping assets of all kinds of public buildings. So the first Aubrey story time was 3 stories that were quite mental, that were completely true. What's been fun is that I've had lots of people messaging me and talking to me about which ones they think are right and which ones are wrong, and while I have to create a complete poker face and have them say, I think this one's the bollocks one, or this one's the true one. Of all the people that came to talk to me about those stories, everyone thought that only one of them was rubbish, and everyone had very sort of convincing theories about which one they thought was right, but they were convinced the other 2 were correct. So how did you get on? Put it in the comment. I'll come back and check later on after the show and see which ones did you think were right and which ones did you think were wrong. That was last week. So let's go on to this week. And before I go any further, I'm going to wet my whistle. Okay, so this week there is a theme. There's sort of 2 themes meandering around, but the main one is famous people, well, not famous people, people with sticky ends and terrible deaths, but also with a vague connection to water and liquid. So if we've got time, there will be 4 stories. If we haven't got time, there will be 3. And I'm just working out whether to give you a clue and tell you how many of them are false or not. In fact, I won't. I'm just going to do the same thing again and read you these stories, or remember these stories with my notes, and you guys can decide. I'll take a break between each one, put some of your theories in the chat, discuss with each other, and then we'll come back to that. So let's start off with... Hello again to part 2, which I wasn't expected to do, of Aubrey's story time, where I'm going to share with you some stories. I have 3, potentially 4 if we have enough time, stories all connected with the idea of freakish deaths and sticky ends surrounding the ideas of around the theme of water and other viscous substances. So you may have noticed you're now sat on the arm of my chair. This is because the cable that's meant to be attached to my light, where the phone is, has decided to give up the ghost and drained the battery, which is why I'm now on a fast charger on my chair. So it's a bit more of a kind of casual, more intimate kind of thing today. But yeah, so apologies about that. I think everyone's comfortable and everyone's rejoined. Shall I continue? I think everyone's in the chat. Who was in the chat before? I hope so. In fact, while I wait for the last few people. Hi, Danny. Last thing before I crack on. While we wait for the last people to rejoin. Great British Book Club. So, whilst I was out and about the weekend, I'll explain more about what happened over the weekend in tomorrow's Fizzy Brain stream. But my current book is now, a book that's added to my pile is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which I found in a phone box. And, yeah. One of the funny things is I found it in one of those phone box libraries that is just made up of 9/10 of its stock is porn, which is quite funny. That phone boxes where you used to get like escort cards and all that sort of stuff in the 80s and 90s and before, and now you basically get Mills and Boone in vast amounts. But I managed to find a copy of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, although I did not find a copy of Dune, because of fucking course I didn't. Anyway, so that's books and such. More about that later on. Let's crack on with tonight's stories. So, like I said, we've got 3, maybe 4 stories to tell you. Just finding my notes. And it's your job in the chat to work out which one is true and which one is false. So let us start. Let's start as there's a lot of fascism in the air. Let's start with a dictator. So the interesting things about living in Southampton is there are lots of really interesting people buried in our ancient graveyard. And this chap is really interesting, not because he's buried in Southampton Ancient Graveyard, it's because he's no longer buried in Southampton Ancient Graveyard. This is, and forgive my pronunciation, Juan Manuel de Rojas, or Rosas. It might be Rojas or Rosas, going by my own terrible writing. So this gentleman used to be the governor of Buenos Aires in the period of the height of his power between 1810 and 1818. What's interesting when... Actually, we'll come to that point a bit later on. So anyway, Juan Manuel was the governor of Buenos Aires, and during the Argentinian civil wars between 1810 and 1818, by the end of the war, he was deposed, his side lost, he fled into exile and came to the UK. Now, what's interesting, at this period of time, Argentina and Britain are actually on quite good relations. In fact, to be fair, most of the time, Argentina and Britain have pretty good relationship. We're all pissed off about the Falkland Islands. Well, the British aren't, because we have them. But it's been a sore spot. But most of the time, Argentina is quite happy to be sort of part of the pro-Britain club. And so Juan Manuel decides Britain's a good place to lay low. Well, I say lay low. He just basically accepts I'm not going to live in Argentina anymore because they want to murder me, so I'll just stay in Britain. And he spends the rest of his life in Britain and passes away in 1877. So he has a good old life here in Blighty, and has a memorial. Well, it's a memorial now, but it used to be his mausoleum in the Southampton Ancient Burial Ground. Now, obviously, the people of Argentina have gone through a lot. In fact, not a lot of South American countries have gone through a lot of sort of different attempts of trying to find their way of going from the post-colonial to sort of the direction they want to go in, and have tried all kinds of things from like Argentina have tried several military juntas, basically a military-style dictatorship. Other nations have tried communism, they've tried all these different things, and it's just sort of settling down as they work out who they are and who they want to be as a nation. And one of the things that keeps popping up every now and then is national reconciliation. So one of these things that comes up is the idea of bringing Juan Manuel back to Argentina, because he represents a group of people used to be a governor, then was kicked out, spent the rest of his life abroad, and then would like to, if we bring him back, then if we can, the idea of the Argentinian government on several occasions was that if we bring him home, we can forgive ourselves, that we can forgive each other, we can work together and move forward as a country, which is a lovely idea. And, it's something that's actually worked, because obviously he's not in Southampton Ancient Burial Ground anymore. They did send him back home to Argentina. So there's several different opportunities when they were trying to get this sorted out, particularly in the 1920s and 30s, when there was what's called the period of Argentinian revisionism, which isn't the case of not exactly like what we define revisionism now, which is seen as very much a negative because it's basically cherry picking your own history. For revisionism in Argentina is the idea of let's acknowledge the bad stuff, but focus on the positives, and then bring ourselves with the goal of bringing people together. It's not revisionism in the case of excluding people, it's meant to be bringing people together. That's the idea. Human beings are tits, whether that happens or not. So they try several times to bring him back. They try in World War II, and then the British point out we're a bit busy, so this isn't high on our priorities in the slightest. The Argentinians are obviously worried that it might get bombed, but the British were like, well, the Germans aren't really going to bomb a graveyard, and amazingly they don't, mainly because they missed. And then the British were they tried later on like 40 years later, but Britain and Argentina, to be fair, were both busy in 1982, and so decided probably not the best time to do it. But when the military junta in Argentina was deposed in 1983, after losing the Falklands War, their new government were all ramped up this idea of reconciliation. And in 1989, along at the same time we got the Berlin Wall falling, there was this idea of bringing old Juan Manuel back home to Argentina. And so it was one of those sort of situations where trying to bring him over went wrong in so many different ways. So at first they thought we better be quiet about this, because the idea of if a bunch of British skinheads or idiots find out that there's an Argentinian leader in Southampton graveyard, ancient graveyard, and Britain is going to sneak his body out of Britain into France, then there could be riots. They thought there obviously wasn't. There could be protests. There could just be people being dickheads or vandalism. So what they decided to do is do it in the middle of the night, because there's nothing says dignity than digging a bloke up in the middle of the night and running off with him. They realised when they took him out of the mausoleum that his coffin was a bit knackered, so they decided to get another one, like build a new one. But instead of getting a British company or nearby or an undertaker to just build a nice one, or bringing one along with you, they go to France and they take his body, his rotting corpse, to France, put him in a coffin, and then take him back to Argentina. So the plan at this point is to put him in the Buenos Aires cathedral, but the Argentinians are Catholics. So there was a papal decree in 1980. Beg your pardon. 1980 is in the 1980s, 1982, I think, at the same time when the war was going on, that the Pope decided, you know what, our priority right now, in the height of the AIDS crisis, the height of war in the Falklands, and the height of the Cold War with the IRA doing things, all these different things, and the height of hijacking as well going on in the Middle East, we are going to send a decree telling you who can be buried in a cathedral. And they decide that it's only for popes, archbishops, and cardinals. So this Juan Manuel, who at this point is probably getting fed up of moving around with his effectively desiccated corpse being moved around the countryside, so they don't have anywhere to put him. But they discover this and they announce this, because they think if we just start putting him in the cathedral, then the Pope will go, who cares? Yeah, just do it. But they tried to sneak him into a cathedral to bury him there. But then the local bishop grasped them up to the Pope. The Pope went, hey, what are you doing? No. And so they had to put him in another mausoleum down the road. But the idea is that, similar to Henry VIII, they are waiting for the right moment to just go pop him into the cathedral when available. Of course, if they did what Henry VIII did, they could put whoever the fuck they want in their cathedrals, because, the Church of England's dogma is written on the back of a fag packet by a guy dying of syphilis and is shagging as many women as possible. But Argentina didn't do that. They decided to stick with the Catholic dogma and keep with it. So poor old Juan Manuel, hero of Argentina, who has been moved around all around the place and even had to spend some time in France to have a new coffin built, is still sort of sitting in semi-storage, waiting to be put into the cathedral, where, quite frankly, considering what's been going on, he surely deserves to go into now. So that's the first story, is that the former governor of Argentina reside in Southampton graveyard, only Southampton ancient graveyard, to be removed in the 1980s in the middle of the night, taken to France, put into a new coffin, and then dumped off in Argentina, where he still sits waiting for his space in the Buenos Aires Cathedral. And that is story number 1. So have a drink. Interesting to hear what you think at this point. I can actually, because the camera's close by, the phone's close by, I can actually see the chat. So it'd be interesting to see if anyone's got any theories. And okay, so question number two, story number two. Moving on, because we can try and rattle through and see if we can squeeze in as many of these as possible, because these stories are great. No, that is notes about a D&D battle. That's not relevant to you. And yes. Okay, second chap. Again, from the Southampton Ancient Burial Ground. I found a lot of them there. Not all of them are from Southampton Ancient Burial Ground, but some of them, quite a few of them are. Actually, a side one. This is true, and it's funny. It's not big enough to have a story, but I think you'll enjoy it. There is someone called Margaret Cheeseyard in the Southampton Ancient Burial Ground, and I looked up on what Mary Cheeseyard has done, and she was renowned. I think it says on her grave as well, someone who suffered no fools and was basically in charge of whatever she was doing. But as one of those cost-saving devices they used to do in that kind of period, with the complete lack of respect they have for themselves, they got on one side of the grave is like two graves either side of the gravestone. One side is I think it's Margaret or Maggie Cheeseyard, and on the other side is a completely different person, just scrolled onto the same gravestone. So it's like, quite utilitarian, but also if you were a believer, wouldn't that piss you off that someone was sharing your gravestone? But anyway, so there is in Southampton ancient graveyard the gravestone of a chap called John Askew, Askew, as in wonky. And he is, what's one of my favourite things about this is that his gravestone is actually leaning to one side. It's wonky. It is askew. And it actually looks like the gravestone is leaning on a tree, because there's a tree nearby and it's pushed it over, but it looks like it's gone the other way. And it just looks like this gravestone is leaning casually on this tree. Now, that's not enough for a story. There's clearly more to it. But John Askew is a marvellous character, because he is sort of a Dom Jolly of his day. If you're not sure who Dom Jolly is, thinking of the audience, he was one of those characters, it's almost like a cross between Punk'd or Trigger Happy TV or Noel's House Party, that sort of thing. Someone that would pull big tricks on people in public, and then get in the press about it and get people to sort of have a good time thinking of these massive elaborate pranks. But he was alive in the Victorian era, between, I think he died in the 1890s, and he was famous in Britain and in the United States. From Southampton, died here and came back home, but spent a lot of time travelling Canada, travelling North America, and travelling the UK, pulling these massive pranks. Now, one of the handy things for an artist like this is at that time, because news travels very slowly, he could do some of these jokes repeatedly in different areas, and they were sort of things like dressing weirdly or turning up to functions. But one of his most famous gags that he played in the US and the UK and Canada with great success, because they always appeared in the news, was that he would make friends with someone on a night out, find someone, get to know them, and then invite them out for dinner. And then they would go to a restaurant. He would sit in the restaurant and eat with this person, chatting away. And then in this restaurant, while they were eating, a fight would break out. And it would start off with a couple of customers, then involve a waiter, then more waiting staff, until basically the entire restaurant was engulfed in a proper brawl. Everything would be smashed, and meanwhile our friend John Askew would be sitting there eating the food as if nothing is going on, with his guests sort of looking like, what on earth is happening? And then at the end of the meal, John would pay for their guest, say thank you very much, and then leave. Of course, what John had actually done is he'd hired actors to be the staff of the entire restaurant and trash it, and also pay the restaurant a decent amount of money to allow them to trash the restaurant to make it believable. And then this person would then be encouraged to report about it in the news. And then you'd be told that this is a John Askew jape, or an Askew jape, or something like that. And he would go around the country doing this sort of stuff all the time. And he seems like quite a jolly fellow, and played a lot of these jokes, but gave spent a lot. He didn't die
He was really, really famous, but didn't die massively rich, not because he was ripped off, but because he spent not an unhealthy amount of money, but a hearty amount of his money on gags involving people, and he would get people to join in with these shows, and like I said, paying restaurants for their time and paying the staff to join in, and then so they could tell these stories and pass it on. And so he just went around having this smashing time pulling these stunts. And of course, the people who were involved, the guests or such, he'd always pay for their meals. He'd always send them a letter thanking them very much, and then inviting them out for a proper dinner and such like that, and thanking them. He was very much he was very chaotic but very kind at the same time, and I felt quite attached to him. But the real climax of the story is something I think sounds sad, but I think he would have enjoyed it. So when he sadly passed away, his wife thought that the local community should come along and come to the funeral and come to the wake, because he was a big name in Southampton. Southampton was rightly proud of him at the time. He was a massive music hall star doing his gags and talking about his gags on stage. So she put an ad in the paper saying that John had sadly passed away. His funeral was on, let's say, Tuesday coming up. He would love to see you there. Please bring flowers, blah, 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 blah. And so when the funeral arrived, no one turned up. It was just his poor old wife, because everyone thought it was a joke. That everyone thought he wasn't really dead. And so she had to send another message in the paper the following day saying, "Hi, no, he really is dead. I was here on my own. This is not a joke. We're going to try... We're going to try the wake again." But the second time round, the whole city came out for him. And there was reports that people couldn't get in the building to see him and such like that. And the wife was inundated with flowers. A lot of people feeling guilty that probably wouldn't have turned up to the original, but felt, I should probably make an effort this time. And so he had a marvellous send-off. And I think, going by the character of the person, and if it was me, I'd find that fucking hilarious. And this is also why, coming back to the opening part of the story, is that I do find a massive amount of charm whenever I see John's little gravestone, which isn't spectacular, it's just there. And also, on his gravestone, it lists his profession as comedian, which is lovely. So it's a trade, it's a real thing, it's an important thing. Anyway, but yeah, the fact that his little gravestone is just leaning casually against a tree, like, haha, I've got a story for you. So yeah, that's story number 2, the tale of John Askew, a man who pulled so many tricks that when it came to his own funeral, no one turned up because no one believed he was dead. Is that true? Or is that bollocks? And I'm going to have another drinky. I forgot to say, the drink I'm having tonight is one of my homebrewed gins, and it is a raspberry flavoured gin, and it is going down very nicely with a tonic. Spectacular. We are running on time. Due to the fact that we did have a late start, I'm going to do all 4 because I think it would be good fun anyway, and I'm enjoying myself. I just realised I should have finished with John, because that's a fun story, because one of them's quite sad and one of them's quite weird. So I think I'll do the sad one and then we'll do the weird one, okay? Right. So this next person had a really unfortunate and sad death, but because of how he suffered, it meant that people coming after him would have better protections and such. So it's not that it's sort of he died in vain or he would have liked that. It's just that some good came out of something really quite sad. So this is a story about a chap called Richard Parker. He's not buried in the Southampton ancient graveyard. He's buried in Pear Tree Church, which is the hill, Pear Tree Hill, which is the hill that overlooks the River Itchen that winds through the centre of Southampton. And on top of that hill is a charming little church called Pear Tree Church, which is very old. I think it's from the 1500s. Been there for quite some time. But there is a grave. It is an empty grave, but with a memorial on it to Richard Parker, a young cabin boy that served on a small yacht that was sailing to Australia with a few people trying to build a new life, but mostly it was a crew and taking supplies. And on their way to Australia, the yacht was overcome by a huge wave and basically damaged beyond repair and started sinking. So the crew got as many supplies as they could, including a load of turnips. For some reason, it's every account I've read about it says is focuses on the turnips. So I don't know whether they're saying that, you know what, if you're ever in a boat, grab all the turnips you can, or whether it's a case of their lives were so shit because look, all they had was turnips. I'll leave you to decide which way around that was. So they grabbed their turnips, they grabbed as much water as they could, and they jumped into the lifeboats. Thankfully, there was enough. It wasn't a Titanic situation. There were enough lifeboats. And so, and they ended up drifting for 19 days. Now, they did ration the food as best they could, because at that point, what people seem to forget is that when it comes to maritime law, there are, because of a necessity, there are lots of actual safety rules and regulations that crews have to do, because basically the way that rules get written in any human society is something has to go wrong and then someone has to look like they're dealing with it, so they create a bit of a rule to sort it out. Now, in the past, there had been terrible situations where poor unfortunate chaps were stuck in boats adrift for many days. So what ended up happening is that the rules have been evolving, where you have this phrase called it's the custom of the sea, and the custom of the sea indicates that you basically have, it's not quite any man for himself, but you are given a leniency in court if you're doing things to survive if there is no other choice. And provided you can prove there is no other choice, then difficult decisions, including the one that comes up, can be taken into account to avoid people being prosecuted. Another story, just to give you sort of a context, it doesn't just mean cannibalism, which is, well, unfortunately, as you may have guessed where we're going. There is another example of another ship where the ship was sinking, and rather than resort into cannibalism, the crew and some of the passengers had gone into two lifeboats, and because of a slow leak and a lack of supplies, that the crew agreed to basically throw passengers overboard to keep it going. Now, where this is interesting, where you got to, the reason I'm telling you this tangent is because it's connected with why this law changed, is under the necessity of the sea, or custom of the sea, basically meant that what the crew had done was their argument for they kept the crew stayed alive, but they started throwing the passengers overboard. And what this meant is that they were charged with murder because they were just killing the crew, and themselves weren't taken into account to make it fair and give people a chance of survival. And their argument was, well, we need the crew to run the ship. So, well, yes, but you need the entire crew to run your entire ship. How many crew do you need to run a lifeboat? You need 2. You don't need 7. So arguably, that's not the last resort. What should have been the last resort is you have 2 members of the crew, that you have to have a minimum of 2 members of the crew, and then everyone else goes into a ballot to be chucked over the side. Then it would be fine. Horrific, but fine in a legal sense. But the main problem we have is that because of this sort of thing, a situation like that, it's not formally written down. This is what you do in an emergency. It's a case of that flimmy-flam thing like the government did many years ago when they said, oh, you can use reasonable force when there is a burglar in your house. What the fuck does that mean? And that's what this necessity of the sea, the custom of the sea, comes forward. And it comes to a head in this poor chap's death, because what happens was, they've been back to our boat with Richard in it, afloat for 19 days, and they're out of food, they're out of supplies. They try everything they can to try and mitigate this, and they even drink salt water. Now, salt water, as we know, that you shouldn't drink it, but they were so desperate they tried it. But they made it worse by Richard Parker, for example, because he was young and I didn't understand. drank a lot more salt water. Didn't just try to wet the lips with it. He actually drank it as if it was like pints of water, and it made him very, very ill. Now, this is where the murkiness comes in, because the crew then decided, we need food, we need liquid, i.e. blood, to survive. So they think he's going to die, we'll kill him and eat him, because he's dying, because he's actually given himself, he's actually starting to act like what happens if you have salt water, which is you start gasping for air, it damages, your respiratory thing starts happening. It's not happy, it's not also not a very pleasant death either. And it is, you could argue, did that actually happen? Did they pretend and say that so they could say it was for safety or for his own good or whatever? Or did they just say, oh yeah, he was drinking salt water, so we thought best to kill him? Either way, that's not the point in argument here. During the evening, he was gasping for breath, barely conscious. They agree that they're going to kill him as painlessly as possible and then butcher his body, including collecting his blood, drinking it to survive, and rationing it. This is where it becomes murky, is the fact that the chap who has the unfortunate job of killing the guy says, unfortunately, he actually speaks to him and says, I think it's along the lines of, because I forgot to write this part down, you've met your end, young man. And then the boy turns round and says, what, you mean me? And then there is a stabbing in the neck, dies instantly. They literally collect his blood in, I think it's a compass case. They pull it and then they wet it on their lips to stop them surviving. They butcher his body. They eat his kidneys and his liver immediately, and then literally cut bits of meat off and put it on the side of the ship to effectively cure, and then dump his carcass over the side. It does save their lives, but in a sort of near Stephen King's The Mist kind of ending, 5 days later they're found by a ship, and when they're taken home, they're immediately charged with murder. Because I think they couldn't have predicted that 5 days later they'd be picked up. But in the reports of it, they said that they would have died if they wouldn't have lasted 5 days if they hadn't done this. It was a necessity. But the problem is there wasn't a free chance of a ballot, because someone suggested putting ballots and they didn't. They just thought, he looks like he's going to die, stab him. But it turns out he wasn't. He was actually could have recovered, and they should have done ballots. Which is, this is what happens: is that someone realised at this point someone needs to firm up what you do or don't do in an emergency when it comes to cannibalism, including stocks of supplies for lifeboats to stop cannibalism. And obviously nowadays it's not an issue, because you have in emergency escape equipment and emergency life-preserving equipment, you have things like water desalinators for water, you have fishing equipment, you have stuff like that to mitigate that need even more, so you can basically survive longer and longer. And also the way that we process food and can make supplies, it's not an issue. But Richard Parker, this horrible case of this poor fellow being murdered and then his friends having to eat him, at least this wouldn't happen again, because rules was put in place to stop this from happening and improve the lot of people on ships. The chaps who, the survivors, were charged with murder, were found guilty of murder, and were sentenced to death. But it was overturned due to public support because of this sort of, they did do it to survive. The case was made. So they spent 6 months in prison, and ironically, one of them went back to Australia and died of the plague. But there is a little bit of reconciliation, because I heard that a relative of Richard Parker apparently met up with the relatives of, some of the survivors, and meant to have literally met up, shaken hands over a pint to sort of show that no hard feelings, but I understand this horrible situation you put in. And effectively, these poor guys were also victims of a horrible accident as well. It's just one of those things. It's just terrible, but at least afterwards it became better. And but Richard does have a little memorial, including a memorial to tells his story, and also talks about how the rules and the laws have changed. And if you're in Southampton, you can test out whether you think this is true or not by going to the Pear Tree Church, if that even exists. It does. And see if you can make a decision whether or not this is true or false, and then go there and then see if it's actually, if there is a grave to Richard Parker. It's not inside the church, it is in the graveyard. Or is it? But what I mean is, it's easy enough to go and, if you want to go and clarify it for yourself, it's easy enough to find. It will be in the, well, if it exists, it will be in the churchyard, not inside the churchyard, because they wanted people to go up and see it and go up and take and pass their respects on without having to go inside the church. Final thing, the story of Richard Parker and being munched on by his chums on the way to Australia was turned into a book that was turned into a film, and that film is The Life of Pi. The tiger that is threatening to eat Pi is the representation, the metaphor of the hunger of the survivors and how he tries to battle and survive. And spoilers, our friend in The Life of Pi survives because the author felt that Richard Parker had such a terrible time that he wanted his version of the character. It's a representation of the hunger and the also survive. So, yes, the story of Richard Parker being in The Life of Pi is also in the chat just had Wessex Girl saying, isn't Richard Parker the tiger in Life of Pi? It's the mirror image of Richard Parker. Pi is the Richard Parker trying to survive, but Richard Parker is also the name of the tiger that's trying to eat him because it's humanity trying to survive and which one of them will survive. It is a metaphor based on the true story of Richard Parker, who was sadly eaten by his chums. Is that true, or is it bollocks? Did I just make up a load of shit when I read the story about Life of Pi? Who knows? Have a think. Have a look up to Pear Tree Church, but don't Google it because I should have mentioned that earlier. Where's the fun in that? Right, so that's story number 3. Yes, we're powering through these, aren't we? Yes, it is. Okay, we've got one more to go. Ooh. So our fourth story takes place in Wales. And unfortunately, the people involved do not have a grave in the Southampton ancient burial ground. In fact, one of them does not have a grave anywhere, which is the point of the story. Let's get my notes. I'm good at this. There we go. So this is in the early 1800s, 1821, is where this sticky story comes to a sticky end. Well, someone comes to a sticky end. A terrible story of murder. And there's no mitigation on this. This is stone cold murder in a very icky kind of way. So I think you'll like this. And it's sad because it starts off with two friends who go into business together. There's a chap called John Barton, known as Barty by his friends, and he is the son of an industrialist who's set to inherit mills and other such things, but wants to strike out on his own and does one of the grand tours of Europe, like all the good people have been doing for centuries, if not thousands of years, if we count the Romans, of just going around and seeing the other cultures and seeing places like Rome and Italy and travelling around. And he met someone, a chap called Matteo, a chap called Matteo Ambrosi, and the two became friends, and they had a lot in common. They went off and had adventures, got very, very drunk, and met women, all sort of things. So picked up Matteo in Italy, and then the two of them travelled to Greece. They travelled across the rest of Europe, and then travelled through India, all the kind of stuff, and then return home. And Barty suggests to Matteo, let's go into business together. I think this industrial revolution is a ripe opportunity for us to make a lot of money. We can make a lot of money by industrializing some ancient practices, because Matteo comes from a family of dairy farmers that can produce and have produced all kinds of cream, butter, all kinds of puddings, and it's based around the idea of milk and cream. They go for all kinds of milk, all kinds of creams, and they are arguably one of those groups that create like it's sort of proto-organic farming. It's what's it called? I should have wrote the next. It was a good word, but I thought I'd remember. It basically means open farming. It's an Italian word for open farming, and it basically means you sort of the happier the cows are, the more the more creamy the milk, the more creamy the cream, the better the cheese, the better the butter. And so he had this idea of having a factory. The two of them had the idea of having a factory close to the workforce, but also close to large dairy farms, which could supply this factory with all of the most freshest milk to make the freshest cream, to make the freshest cheeses, make the freshest butters, for the ingredients to create not only cream, milk, blah, 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 but also if they created desserts, you could have effectively what is effectively the modern equivalent of a dessert ready meal, where you would have your, batch cooked puddings and the sauces that go with it, put them together, and then nom, 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 nom. It was an idea that would make them lots and lots of money. And they started off building it up. Got the farmland, got the factories, and then built them up, and these factories ended up, like Cadbury and Ironbridge Gorge, built these support towns around these factories where the workers could live. They could have schools, they can have theatres, they can have pubs. They tried not having pubs first because they thought that's what would ruin everything, and then everyone complained so much they built a pub, and then they realised people actually have fun in the pubs and they can make more money from the pubs, and that sort of built more in. And it was doing really, 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 really well, and kept expanding and expanding and expanding. And then it got to the point that all businesses get to when they get too many people and things start going wrong. And I don't mean the quality or practices or things like that. It's just the way that people act together. You may have heard of fights between dockers and painters. This is something that happens particularly in Australia, but also in places like Liverpool, Glasgow, London and stuff like that. Not so much in Southampton and in Hampshire and Portsmouth, where basically people get really protective of their trades, and people would end up like football hooligans, fight and get into fights outside pubs. You have painter pubs and docker pubs, and you'd also have like welders pubs and all these sort of things, but the main groups are dockers and painters. And you basically would have on a Saturday night where these guys, after a hard week of working, would then kick the shit out of each other and then go have more pints and then kick the shit out of each other again. This started happening in these towns, where basically different groups of the factories started going against each other. So basically you would have a lot of the guys who were working on the dairy side, who originally called themselves clotters and creamers, and then they would just end up turning into clotters. And so these guys would then go and beat the shit out of the guys that worked in the sort of pudding siders. And originally they were called puddings or puddingers and stuff like that, and they realised that was silly. Of course, one of those funny things in the Victorian era, they come up with ideas of names, and at the time they're really aggressive, but then now we look back and go, that's stupid name. Like even like Peaky Blinders, when you think about that, it's such a dumb name. But at the time, sounded terrifying. But it ended up with these different groups amalgamating into these gangs where you would have the Clotters versus the Creamers. The Clotters versus the Ricers. Now, so the Ricers are the guys that worked in the pudding. So they were effectively, the cream would be put into the rice to make rice cream, a rice pudding and such. So the Clotters and the Ricers would kick the shit out of each other. And I did hear, one of the things that was nice, it was sort of like, I thought I'd add to the story, but it turned out to be complete bollocks. So, but that in itself is worth putting in the story, which is the idea that to get clotted or clot someone over the head came from these fights. But that turned out to be hyperbolic and just a load of bollocks. It's just these guys would kick the shit out of each other. And like I say, this could say the same thing for getting creamed. It's just, it's this typical British pastime of putting ed on the end of any word, and it either means fighting or drinking. So anyway, these Clotters and Ricers, or the Ricers and Creamers, would just fight into the point where real animosity split up between the two parts of the company. And so they actually started breaking up these small communities and selling them off and getting people to move in different areas. And they tried actually separating the factory. But this is what led to a rift between Barty and Matteo, because Matteo didn't want to split the company up. He didn't want to move the farmyard, the factories away from the farms, because that would lower the quality. It just wouldn't work. And then Barty, who was more money driven, thought that would be more effective. We can use the canal system, and it got worse and worse, and it almost sort of got to the point where they were emulating these the Clotters and Ricers, where they just basically fell out, and the company itself that they built together and was named after them, both of them, which was Aubrey and Barton. And Aubrey and Barton ended up sort of splitting up as to they were coming close to falling apart. They did end up splitting in the end, but the only reason it split up in the end is because Barty, who was promoting the idea, was really for the idea of splitting it up, and then so they could control their own parts of the company, disappears. And this is where it gets weird, because Barty gets his way and Matteo changes his mind, because Matteo, remember, is the one that wants to keep everything together, keep the even though the workers are kicking the shit out of each other, keeping the factories close to the farms is good for the business. He's arguing that, and Barty's saying, no, move them around, use the canal system, we'll get the money in that way, we'll get the workers won't be beating the shit out of each other. So he's arguing to split it up. Barton disappears, and people have claimed foul play, and this is in 1821, this is where the murder, what it turns out to be murder, disappears, and then suddenly Matteo actually says, let's split the company up, let's do what he wants to do. And because people originally thought, when people looked at the benefit hindsight, they thought, well, he can't be accused of murder because he's now doing not what he wants, he's doing what Barty wants. So is this like a friendship going, oh no, my friend's gone, I should do this? But then some people have said, is it guilt or something like this? Because Barton turns up nearly 3 months later, and this shows you the sort of health and safety rules and the cleaning and cleanliness of some of these things, because this is what causes the companies to split up and actually breaks it in two, is he is found in a vat of rice pudding right at the bottom, half sort of like, brutally murdered, and then just sort of decomposing in rice pudding, which is horrible. So yeah, Barton gets murdered and the body is disposed of. Although some people said, did he fall into a vat of rice pudding? but there's also the thing of why would he be there? Why would he be involved? Why would he be there? But then it's a very elaborate way of getting rid of someone, considering there is the railway network, there is the canal network. It's very strange that basically, why would he be murdered? If he was murdered, what a really weird way to hide the body. But also, if you're going to murder him and then do exactly what he wants, why did you murder him in the first place? It's just delightfully silly. But why did I tell you this story? Because there's lots of murder and intrigue all over the place. The name of the company. The company still exists. Barty's name was taken off of it, but the "and" sort of got worn down. So Matteo Ambrosi used to be, and his name was called John Barty Barton, so it was Ambrosi and Barton. Barton was removed and it became Ambrosia. So Ambrosia Rice Pudding is named, is a company that one of its original founders was found dead in the rice pudding. Which, yeah, I laughed for quite some time when I found that out. So yeah, if you're ever eating a rice pudding, just think there might be a little bit of Barty Barton in it. There's an extra bit of flavouring. If you ever see any black bits in your rice pudding as well, could be a little bit of his leftover remains. Ooh. Anyway, that is story number 4. Those are our 4 stories. So, in summary, story number 1, the Argentinian, the governor of Buenos Aires, who escaped exile to Britain, buried in Southampton, and then in the middle of the night, to avoid diplomatic problems, was smuggled to France, put into a new coffin, then moved to Argentina, where he currently sits in storage, waiting to be put into the cathedral, where quite frankly he deserves, because he's earned that, surely. John Askew, the guy that pulled so many jokes on people that when he died, no one believed he was dead, and he had he had to do his funeral twice, or his wake twice, but because no one turned up. Richard Parker, the chap that was munched down on by his chums, and then sadly, then led to the changing of the law to protect people from cannibalism. And then finally, the sad death of Barty, who was made an empire of rice pudding, cream, and all such things, and ended up dead in a vat of rice pudding. And also the forerunner of Ambrosia. Poor fucker. So yeah, 4 stories. They could all be true. They could all be bollocks. One of them could be bollocks. 2 of them could be bollocks. What do you think? Are we putting the a breakdown of the stories in the comments for this? And on the videos, I'm going to put on the usual bits and pieces on Patreon for you to check out and download to your own pleasure. And I will be creating a version of this podcast probably in a couple of days, because I need to edit it and put it together, part 1 and part 2, for your listening again. If you want to listen again, feel free to go to Patreon, follow on the free account, and you have access to listings. You also have release dates of music and such a little bit earlier than everyone else. And you also have access to downloads of this podcast and the Fizzy Brain podcast as well. Or you can follow me on all the usual places: Bluesky, Instagram, not X, Twitter, because fuck that, Facebook and all the meta places, even though that's a fucking dumpster fire, because we have to do social media as best as we can. There will be more live streaming goodness tomorrow night at 9 o'clock, and every Tuesday at 9 o'clock. I've got quite a few things to tell you guys about, actually, if you're going to join me, because I've got there's all kinds of wonders. We've got forest bathing, we've got death, lots of death, an accidental gig with Gaz Brookfield that went down really well, where we pissed off the Village Green Preservation Society in Hambledon, the place where cricket was invented, where I found a copy of 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea in a phone box, and various other delights that I'd love to have you guys join me on as well, and a couple of new songs that I'm going to play. Well, one new song I'm going to play for you guys. about the Tadley Treacle Mines, which I'll tell you all about. And that is a story that is utter bollocks, because that's the point of the story. And I hope you'll join me for that. A little bit of an update before I go, based on what's coming up in the next week or so. And I did put the listings up. Where they gone? No, not that button. No, not that button. That button. Yeah, there we go. Right, so on the 27th of February, I am off to Swindon in the to the Tuppenny with B-Sides. It's a free entry. 28th, I'm off to Newstead with the Pit with B-Sides and Sam Tucker. I'm going to be making an announcement very soon, because Madam Misfit has been going through the ringer, and like I've said before in previous streams and various other messages, Sarah is an absolute sweetheart, and she is troubled by anxiety and overthinking things. She's had a fucking rough time. So if you want to cheer up someone that could do with a bit of support, because she is rather ill, not in a dangerous way, but she seems to be getting all the illnesses at the same time, give Madam Misfit a bit of love. Say that I sent you and said, because she's great. And also check out her new album, which is fucking great fun as well. Then off to the 1st of March, off to London to the Two Bridges with Tom B. Wild. That's going to be marvellous. And then March, I'm rehearsing for a play, because I have all kinds of theatrical shit. On the 19th of March, we have the Call Me Mother performance at the Mass Theatre in Southampton. So come and join us. And then afterwards, 21st is Salisbury. We're at the Winnie Gate, but more about the rest of March later on, because we haven't even finished with February. I'm jumping ahead. Let's calm down. Anyway, those listings are available on all the social media channels, particularly Patreon. I'll be going about Patreon quite a lot, because I fucking love Patreon. Yes, so there's new music, there's excitement going on, all kinds of things. And also, I've got lots to tell you about sock puppet dragons. I've finally found out what I'm going to do with my sock puppets, and it's been absolutely marvellous. So, yes, for those of you listening on the live stream, I will bid you adieu. Thank you very much for joining, for tuning in, streaming, however. And for those of you who are on Twitch, I'm going to hang around and we'll talk some bollocks, go through some theories on which of these stories you quite liked, which little things you didn't like, and also what people have been reading and what we're drinking, as always. And if you want to join in on that, and you're listening to the podcast version, or you're watching this on YouTube or whatever, follow me on Twitch, because I'm on 49 followers at the moment. If I get one more, it's a very pleasing 50, and apparently there's a sticker thing that I get from that. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me for story time. Next one will be the last Monday of March, and I can't remember the date for that off the top of my head, because I should have planned that, but I didn't, because I'm an idiot. So let's have a look at my calendar. My calendar says the last March is the 24th. Fabulous. Am I doing something? I'm not doing something. Wonderful. So, oh no, wait, I'm on holiday. Am I on holiday? Yes, I'm on holiday. So I might do a stream for you know what? I think I will, because my holiday has a hot tub in it. So I may do the Aubrey story time next month from a hot tub. That'd be good. And hopefully I won't electrocute myself. So yes, like I said, otherwise join me every Tuesday at 9 p.m. for Fizzy Brain, where I talk bollocks about what I'm doing as a musician and go from there. Anyway, thank you very much, those of you listening on Catch Up. I will see you another time. If you have a drink in your hand, raise it up and put it in your face. Lovely.